Hi, everybody. One thing I've enjoyed is almost every speaker has given a preface. In fact, every one of us gave a preface to our formative upbringing and then some of our chosen positions older. Let me do that, but I want to preface it, first of all, with maybe my office in the church. Can I do that first? First of all, I rarely speak to a crowd where I mean this sincerely. Thank you. I know who I'm speaking to, regional leaders. I am looking around right now. This probably ranks as in the top 3 most important conversations I've had in a year because of who's in the room. I want to honor what you do. I want to honor the trenches of where you live and say thank you. I am a teacher. You are about to get me fully unfurling in my teaching gift, and let me remind you what that means. It will be comfortable for some. It will largely be uncomfortable for all. You may get nervous about my pulpit ministry. Do not. You did not invite me here to pulpit ministry a congregation. You invited me here to instruct and steward a regional group of leaders who have to think through something. There is a difference. So I will ask you for grace in that I am speaking as someone who's speaking to a room of regional leaders. And I am speaking and responding to someone who decided that he had a national prophetic word with admonitions unto calling leaders sinful. And that is a powerful word. Eric Metaxes deserves to be heard because of his history. However, he must then put up with a regional teaching anointing or office saying, can I talk to you about that for a second? So that's what you're going to experience. I'll give you a little warning. Now, the beauty is you should be pretty safe because my chosen apostles in the room, Barry Whistler, my chosen pastors in the room, Kevin Etchelman, my chosen prophets in the room, Wade Kaufman. I have open applications for an evangelist, so if anyone wants to apply for that. And I have Jimmy Nyman, who's what I call my soft prophet, who's in my world. But that's usually over a whiskey, so that gets complicated too. So if there's anything I've done, I highly recommend you talk to the team that I submit myself to because, and remind you, one of them invited me. Now, secondly, I grew up in a family that was deeply involved in the moral majority movement. Matter of fact, that's all I knew. You ever grow up and you don't have another option even to have as a reference point? Right? You just are, I mean, the Amish guy raises his hand. That's so, you win, Steve. Fold. So all that to say, I grew up in the moral majority, didn't even know it was an option, right? Matter of fact, in my church, if you had a calling on your life, it was one of 3 things. You were going to become a pastor, an overseas missionary, or join the military. Matter of fact, if I totaled the days that we honored one of those 3 offices, it was 2 to 1 that we honored our military people. Because we were, as I look back, what I would say, a Jesus-loving American civic religion that actually, quite honestly, had more political rhetoric involved in my discipleship. No, as much political rhetoric involved in my discipleship as what I would call straight up New Testament teaching. You don't have a reference point for that when you're young. Matter of fact, I don't even cast dispersions on it. First of all, I think it's dumb to kick your cradle because of what God is able to do with your cradle, right? But I will remind you, I had a deeply formative upbringing. Matter of fact, I was actually completing my application to the Air Force Academy. Come on, dudes. I looked up which one made you do the most pull-ups. I know. Like, yeah, I looked at even the health requirements for the Army and was like, no, thanks. I'm gonna pass on that. I was completing my application to the Colorado Springs Air Force Academy when it dawned on me, hey, I'm not sure if I really want to do this. This is my culture suggesting something to me. And I decided I wanted to be a hedonist. You all were thinking I was going to become a missionary, didn't you? No, I actually said I want to make $1 million by 30. I'll give a bunch of it to the church. So I distinctly remember when I made over a 3-week period a decision that I was going to go become a businessman, which we would now call Kingdom Marketplace, but back then I didn't have some strategic orientation for it. I was just going to be a good churchman, make money, and give you my tithe. You would have probably liked me, most of you, huh? And taught your Sunday school classes. But I'll let you know, the Lord intersected my life. And so I just want to make sure that I honor a bit of what I believe Eric Metaxes is doing in his book, but I have to significantly push back on it. Now, when I say that, every pastor in this church received a copy from concerned members of our community, right? And by the way, I tend to look at everything I'm given. And believe me, in a church of roughly 3,000 who call it home, you get some stuff given to you. I want to honor Eric Metaxes. First of all, I come from an academic background as well, that we do book reviews. You don't do reviews on someone unless you care about what they said. Just let me say that out front. You don't accept those. I mean, you read their books and you're like, that's not even worth my engagement. And so the simple fact that I'm going to spend some time talking to you about this book is because I care about it, right? And I especially care what he tried to do with it. I also want to honor him for this book, his book on Bonhoeffer. How many of you were impacted by it, right? A tremendous work about the life of Bonhoeffer. Matter of fact, he takes his research for that book and he applies it to the challenge that he now gives the church. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to read you from the publisher's promotional piece on this book. Now, I read this one because the author gets to sign off on the publisher's promotion. So I'm reading this as if this is the promotional advertisement from Metaxes for his book. The author of a best-selling biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Metaxes reveals the haunting similarities between today's American church and the German church of the 1930s. Echoing the German martyr's prophetic call, he exhorts his fellow Christians to repent of their silence in the face of evil. God calls us to defend the unborn, to confront the lies of cultural Marxism, and to battle the globalist tyranny that crushes human freedom. Confident that this is God's fight, the church must overcome fear and enter the fray, armed with the spiritual weapons of prayer, self-sacrifice, and love. All right, that is the promotional piece that was put forward by the publisher of the book. Metaxes goes on to give us, I'm giving you 4 summaries. By the way, I'm being very careful, trying not to set up what's called a straw man, where I set up Metaxes' argument and knock it over easily. But he argues 4 points. The American church is committing the same mistakes in the 2020s as the German church did in the 1930s. If we continue course, similar catastrophic consequences await. By choosing silence, German pastors facilitated the rise of Nazism, and the innocent blood of millions is on their hands, a common phrase in his book. The current complicity of the American church, especially its pastors, leads to a similar, quote, red-handed guilt. Metaxes urges Christians to fight against Marxist ideology, abortion, same-sex marriage, transgenderism, critical race theory, Black Lives Matters, and government policies that threaten religious liberty. He rates to motivate pastors to raise their voices and lead their members to political activism. I'm giving you a quick, trying to honor the major themes of his book. And I want to now, if you don't mind, I want to share with you 4 cautions as I've sat with the book. I have not simply sat with the book. I talked with people who've been influenced positively and less than positively by it. And I would just like to suggest what I call 4 cautions when something like this takes place. My first one is this. Keep your prophetic exhortations local for now. Whenever the larger spirit and culture is polarism, be careful how you engage. You heard it all over Kevin as a practitioner, right? Stay local for a bit. I'm not sure about you. With what we've walked through in the last 3 years, I am extremely nervous about national prophets. That does not mean they're wrong. I'm simply telling you that when you begin to branch out to make extremely broad statements in the midst of a polarized megaculture, you are going to possibly get co-opted yourself. And I'm going to try to show you that now, right? Now, my biggest is not a cultural argument, it's a biblical argument. Friends, the closest we get to anyone writing a letter to a national church is the book of Revelation, written to 7 churches in Asia Minor. And it is written by a guy named Jesus. Even Jesus doesn't speak the entire region of Turkey where these 7 churches are located. I did a little research. In Ephesus and greater Ephesus alone, you draw a 40-mile circle around Ephesus, it was believed there was approximately 100 churches in that region, right? In all of Asia Minor, it was already approaching by the time of roughly 90 when the book of Revelation was written. Turkey would have been hosting somewhere near 700 churches. 7 of them, and you could argue, but hold it, Ephesus had a couple dozen. Maybe it was a regional letter. I will give you even a regional letter. but I want to remind you of the structure of Jesus' letters to the church. Can I just remind you, the common themes among the 7 letters goes like this. The Lord first addresses each church individually and identifies himself by a particular name to them. Oftentimes that name is a name that would be part of meeting their most predominant need. Then he defines things that he knows about that particular church in question. After this, a challenge or a reproach is given, followed by a promise. In all 7 cases, this admonition is the most consistent among all 7 churches. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Then, although the letters differ in length in accords to the needs of each community, all conclude with the same appeal, quote, hold fast and listen to what the Spirit is saying to your church. Each church is promised that everyone who does will conquer and be rewarded by Jesus. Jesus paused and spoke to 7 regional issues in 7 specific issues to 7 churches in a region. He does not in any place launch an all-out wide mandate to the church. Now you're just like, but Jim, the New Testament. You tell me about the New Testament. You tell me about the book of Ephesus. It is a mandate to all of us, isn't it? But it's a mandate that flowed out of a particular. And I'll remind you how the New Testament came together. It wasn't a bunch of white guys with beards, bad hipster haircuts, sitting in Nicaea deciding on this thing. Friends, it was the New Testament scriptures were already obvious by the time of Nicaea in 314. They were wrestling over some James, or Luther certainly was upset where they landed on that one, right? But they were wrestling over nuances. Do you want to know one of the lead ways that we knew a piece of scripture was for the entire church? It was when it was read in a differing city, the Spirit fell in the same way it fell in the first city it was read. When there was commonality of how the Spirit fell, then it was like, hold a second, there's something on that letter, right? Now, how many letters from the apostles were read in locales that when they were reread, it was like, woo, Smyrna's screwed up. You probably had theories of a letter that might have been read there. So I want to remind you, I get incredibly nervous when a national prophet, much less in a particularly polarized time, decides to write a letter to us all. Now, here's your pushback on Jim's argument. But Jim, come on, isn't it obvious he's writing to the evangelical church? Well, friend, you better then say that. And you better help me understand the 9 sacred pathways that we've learned evangelicals receive through. And you better then help me understand what we do with the other 5 streams of the church, the holiness stream, which is so closely linked to the evangelical stream, and the evangelicals who are wrestling over the social justice stream's influences, right? You better give me a far more nuanced understanding of what's going on than what I'm experiencing in this book. By the way, you're catching a bit of animation in me because I don't mind a book that you're floating with the words I'd like to suggest. You tell me I have blood on my hands? You tell me I have blood on my hands? You're going to remind me, my charge as a teaching pastor is to body check bad theology and thinking. I am not here to tell you what to think. I'm here to help you how to think. And I am going to body check this work first because it lacks the regional nuance that a message of this nature that involves blood on the hand needs to have involved with it. Sorry, a little bit of animation. Second caution. Am I all right still, Barry? Can I keep going? Would you please remember, know and guard. By the way, you can all have this PowerPoint. If you promise not to post anything about me where you haven't sat with me over lunch first, right? It's all yours. I'll make sure that Matt gets it distributed to you all so you don't have to race and take notes because I got a little technical in some spots. But I want to remind you, know and guard your theoretical blind side. I am all for your passionate front side. Whatever your passionate front side is, and I speak to anyone in this room, I speak to a group that gave me this book, I'm all for your passionate front side, right? But I will remind you, I will get nervous as one of your teaching pastors if I don't think you know your theoretical blind side. Cool? You follow what I'm getting at there? Let me just show you what that is in this particular instance. Sorry, let me go back. On the theoretical blind side, this is how Metaxes frames his entire work addressing this thing, right? He says this, quote, God calls us to defend the unborn, to confront the lies of cultural Marxism, and to battle the government-led globalist tyranny that crushes human freedom. Be confident that this is the spirit of God's current fight, and overcome the anxiety and fear and enter the fray. That's Metaxes' quote of what he's encouraging us to do. Now, how many of us wouldn't agree that we as the church, according to 2 Corinthians 10:5, are not called to demolish every thought that raises itself against the knowledge of God? Are we not? Right? That is our calling, to demolish every thought that raises itself against the knowledge of God. And I want to tell you something. I think the progressive left needs to be confronted in some things. May I say that? Right? I need to remind Mr. Metaxes, however, that Bonhoeffer was fighting the radicalized right, not the leftist, progressive left. Let me remind you, the Nazi movement was a political right nationalist party embellished with Christian rhetoric to the point of creating a monopolistic race known as the Aryans, who had truer being and purpose for the world than any other race. I want to, as much as we evangelicals like to claim Bonhoeffer as ours, friends, I was educated in the same schools he was educated in. I was there. Friends, I was elected to be on the curriculum committee as a student at Yale Divinity School. No new curriculum for the 3 years that I was in that position was allowed to be approved by the faculty until I signed off on it. I saw everything. I was then elected to be the student vote for whenever a new faculty person was coming on. I sat in meetings that, friends, I tell you, only 2 people have ever been told what I heard in meetings at Yale Divinity School. I could have written books that would have put me on the speaking tour. I could have been a golden child of the political right. Maybe, I don't know. Would you let me dream, Jimmy? Come on, Jimmy, let me dream. Come on, I got pocket scarves. I can do this. I got pocket scarves and round glasses. I got everything you need. I am the exact Target 40 regular. I don't even have to buy custom jackets, people. I would have made it big on the cheap. Friends, I've heard things said about the progressive left and what they felt their calling was against what you and I would call our conservative positions. I'm going to tell you what. One, they're not as organized as you think. I'll give you a hint. And secondly, most of them are displaced pastors, right? Carrying a lot of trauma, a lot of baggage. Very few apostles. Most of the teachers I sat with were barely teachers. Most of them that I hung out with were displaced pastors. I developed an incredible compassion for them. And I want to remind you something, that one of the things that takes place is that when we sit and we talk about these ideologies that raise themselves against the knowledge of God, we detach from the individuals and the storylines that have built them, right? And we end up then attacking things, for instance, saying, I want to take on the political left. But I'm going to give you a hint. The challenge of taking on the political left actually makes you vulnerable to being co-opted by the far right. That's how they both work. Let me read something to you, right? I question Metaxes' use of Bonhoeffer and the Nazis to forward this war that we are launching on the progressive left. Bonhoeffer fought the radical right, not the left. Hitler was a far-right nationalist that used populist strategy to take power and to build a monocultural expression of Aryan life. That is what Bonhoeffer spoke against. Metaxes has every right to take Bonhoeffer as a broad theorist, saying that we should take on every ideology that raises itself against the knowledge of God. But in our push to attack one position, we're capable of not guarding our rear, our theoretical blind side. If you set, let me give you this. This is maybe me slipping in the prophetic. Wayne can have this if he wants and tell you whether or not I'm on. If you set out to attack the far left, the devil will not attempt to stop you by fighting your arguments, but by tricking you into sinking your base too far into the radical right. You will lose your power, your priesthood, and your authority. The devil will not try to stop you with your arguments against the left. He will try to get you to sink your roots too far into the right. This is Chuck Colson, whom I went and looked up a little bit of Chuck Colson because Metaxes loves him. And we all remember Chuck, right? Kingdoms in Conflict. We respect the deep work that this man did coming out of the trenches of Watergate, his own conversion and the understanding of everything that took place. This is what Colson used to say when he was sitting in the Oval Office and he saw Nixon's ability to manipulate people's thinking, right? That was some interesting times. Anyone remember that? It's like, we think things are scary now given the characters, but man, friends, did anyone think some idealism around Washington got blown up in those seasons? But this is what Colson said. He said this: Colson witnessed Nixon's masterful skills in manipulating leaders, particularly evangelicals, for political ends. He reflected, quote, ironically, none were more compliant than the religious leaders. Of all the people, they should have been the most aware of the sinful nature of man and be least overwhelmed by the pomp and protocol. But theological knowledge too often wilts in the face of worldly power. That's Chuck Colson, right? He went on to say this: yeah, of all people, we as church leaders should be aware. Since our nation's inception, a common and effective strategy on both left and right has been to praise and pressure American pastors into serving a partisan political position. Letter to the American church, in my opinion, got swept up in this strategy. In many evangelical churches, it's going to require great pastoral courage to say so. If your local community, this is my request to you now as a pastor, if your local community is focused on dismantling the ideologies and activities of the political left, I'm asking you to put at least half as much energy into guarding your theological rear. Hey, let's make this fun. Guard your theological rear end, people. You follow me? I do not mind where you land when we're done today. As your friend and as one of your teaching pastors, I will say this: you better be able to tell me where your theoretical rear end is, right? It will be taken on by the enemy. He'll try to pinch it. Now, caution number 3. Practice principled political persuasion. This was actually Chuck Colson's phrase, by the way. I just stole it from him. So good. Practice principled political persuasion. Metaxes said there's 4 things, and it's desperate times. He says, because of the desperate times we're in, I'm going to suggest to you 4 things the church isn't doing but must do. Number 1, Christian followers may need to, quote, vote for someone whom others may criticize for being guilty of this or that. Let me repeat that. By the way, can I back up one? I think my slides, sorry, I left one out. But I'll read this one again. Christ followers may need to, quote, vote for someone whom others may criticize for being guilty of this or that. Next one. Christians may need to, quote, tell a lie for the larger good. Right? Page 120. Have fun with it. Now, by the way, he's a brilliant historian, and he's going to put it in wonderful frames of the Nazis come to your door and you have a Jew hidden. But friends, it's a complex question, isn't it? But he's going to promote that we've got to put down a little bit of the moral fortitude we've been carrying in certain areas if we're going to see real change happen in the nation, right? By the way, these are not the first times we heard these things, right? These kinds of things. Christians can do these things because we, quote, serve a God who has a wildness and unpredictability to him, right? Page 123. By the way, I am not trying to unconvince Eric Metaxes. I'm just letting you know he chose a particular angle of how we should go about engaging the political realm in these days. I'm just making you aware that he's not the first to do this. And truthfully, I've sat and had these thoughts, right? I've had these thoughts. Come on, right? Lesser of 2 evils, how many? There's a great argument of, are we voting for a lesser? My favorite last time around was this. Hey, I'm not voting for my next Valentine's Day date. And Rachel was glad to hear that. I'll have to say. I get that, right? And like Bonhoeffer in opposition to Hitler, violence may be necessary should the establishment not be paying attention. Now, I just want to suggest to you that Metaxes, as a historian, is doing something that if we were reviewing this book at an academic center, we would chew his lunch. because historians are only allowed to moralize to a certain point. This is where Christian ethicists, this is where moral theologians come in. These are long argued understandings and wrestlings over what the church has thought for 2,000 years. This doesn't mean that I'm trying to lock up this conversation in some ivory tower. I'm just trying to remind you, don't run too fast and loose with it either, right? That we need to pause in moments and go, hey, let us wrap our heads fully around what that does. For instance, Kevin and Barry in particular said, hey, just so you know, if you're going to hold this great, know what it cost you on the evangelism front. Let me repeat that. Always, I will, as a friend and a discipler, I will always ask you this, man, have your position. Have your screen door. I am cool with it. I will remind you, have you examined the implications of that position? It will cost you on the evangelism front if you have decided to take on political ideology as the lead aspect of your Christian contribution in the world. It just simply will. Are you willing to do that? And if you are, more power to you. I'd love to have one conversation before you decide it, but other than that, it's not my role to do that. I just need to remind you of what happens in these situations. Now, next, we have to also say this. When several prominent evangelical leaders pushed back on this book, he tweeted about a talk that he was holding coming up, and the talk was entitled this: Maybe Rick Warren, Andy Stanley, and Tim Keller are Hitler's favorite kinds of pastors. Again, I am not holding a man to the digital tweet world, right? By the way, I want to repeat to make sure I do this with integrity. He did not tweet that. That was the title of his talk. This is what he actually tweeted. Quote, I didn't come up with this title, but it brings up a very important point, period. Let me repeat the title. Maybe Rick Warren, Andy Stanley, and Tim Keller are Hitler's favorite kinds of pastors. And you want to know what his biggest argument against it was? They're too evangelically focused. I'm not sure if you read the book. He put an entire chapter in on the problem of evangelicalism right now. He actually argued that we are so concerned with evangelizing people, we're not getting involved in politics. Friends, can I ask you something? How many of you right now are sitting and thinking, I am deeply concerned about my church's overemphasis on evangelism and how it's costing us on the political front? You know what most of us are thinking? I'm deeply concerned about my church's emphasis on politics and it's costing us on the evangelism front. But Metaxes sets up what I call a straw man, and I just have to push back on him. He sets up an entire chapter saying, I think the church in America is so focused on whether or not their witness still works for people that we're not standing up hard against the ugliness of the progressive left. Let me repeat that. I want to honor him with his argument. His argument is this: I think you are all so focused as the evangelical church on seeker sensitivity or reaching people or something that you are letting the political agenda slip away from you, right? I want to stand before you and say, I don't think it's that easy. I think that is what's called a straw man argument, too easy to set up and knock down, and I don't actually think that that's the challenge. I think we are wrestling with the tension between being a people of truth who also engage with larger culture around us, right? And to not lose our witness authority and priesthood in the midst of doing that. That's the complexity. We need a much more nuanced book to address that, right? And you can't necessarily tell me that my church, this church, Kevin's church, Elder's church, is actually too emphasized on evangelism or seeker sensitivity to just politics. You just heard from our lead pastor. That's not our thing. Last but not least, thank you for letting me do this. I know this is not easy or fun stuff. By the way, Chuck Colson said this. Can I just throw one more Chuck up here? If we've learned, by the way, he wrote this in 2004. This is toward the end of his career, right? If we've learned anything in recent decades, it is that we should not roll out heavy-handed political movements that recklessly toss around God and country cliches and scare off our secular neighbors. Our goal is not to grab power and impose our views. Instead, we should act through principled persuasion and responsible participation, right? That is a sage in this field that should be honored toward the end of his life. And believe me, he sat in way more intense conversations than this, right? He has pushed and pulled on this topic for a long time. Principled political persuasion is something. Here's my last caution. Honor faithful local presence. In the chapter titled The Idol of Evangelism, Metaxes contends that there's some who have this fixed idea that evangelism is the most important and really the only thing worth doing. He then goes on, and this is done. I stopped counting the pages that he made this statement. Metaxes repeatedly rebukes American pastors as cowardly, timid, and afraid to speak the truth. I think I respectfully disagree. I want to honor the fact that that contingency is out there, but I want to let you know that I will have to possibly tell you that this book is not only one I disagree with, I actually think it could be destructive to the way we posture. And I feel like I have to confront someone who positioned himself as a national prophet and say that I do not believe some of what I actually believe are straw man images of the church he set up and knocked over. I don't even think Bonhoeffer, if he was sitting here, would agree with this book. May I go as far as to say that? I believe that Bonhoeffer, who was here talking to us today, would not be confronting the rise of the far left progressive thing. He'd be confronting the rise of American civic religion in our communities. That the biggest religion that we now are worshiping as the church in North America is the embeddedness of political aspirations with the gospel. And I think Bonhoeffer confronted it with Hitler, and I think he'd look at us now, right now, and say it. So I respectfully would argue that this book hijacked a little bit of a historical figure for a convenient argument. Now, notice what I have not said. I have not said that we should not be battling the political left. Here is my conclusion. Since our nation's inception, a common and effective strategy on both left and right has been to praise and pressure American pastors into serving a partisan political agenda. Letter to the American church is swept up in that strategy. In many evangelical churches, it will require great pastoral courage to say so. And some references for you at the end. So I'm going to remind you that as we consider this book and what we're up to in this day, it is one that we have to carry with a little bit of care and concern now. Go and do what the Spirit is saying for you to do and to submit it to your local community. And you'll notice something about this one. We have not stopped anyone from doing the things that they feel Jesus is calling them to do. However, we are here to do a little body checking. Just keep in mind your theoretical rear end. And on that note, thanks, friends.